4K video is huge, and storing a lot of it can be a problem. That's why we want to share with you our storage journey, how we've gone from single SSDs that only one editor can interface with, to how and why we've built a massive custom storage solution that's both redundant and big enough where we could store every video we've ever made twice. So, Morgan, what were things like when you first got here?
Yeah, so when I first came on board here with the team, very early on in the studio, it was one hyperdeck, and you guys were just recording program, as you can see here in this photo. And so it was a pretty simple workflow. Many content creators might be familiar with these little SanDisk SSDs that you can have. All of that was just plugged into a single Mac Mini and being synced up to Dropbox. And that was the entire workflow for quite a while. And that works great if it's just one person editing. But as we continued to expand the team, work on multiple projects at the same time, we needed more space. And that's when the server racks started coming into play and things like that. And with that, we ended up with a 32 terabyte Synology that we started off with.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is there wasn't a decision made necessarily like, oh, we need to get a NAS. It literally just came with one of the server racks. And so that was something that, you know, we actually got a little ahead of the decision of deciding to buy a NAS because we saw, hey, this is useful. We were still in that kind of single editor workflow, but we saw that it was useful. But what kept happening is it kept filling. Right. So we had this 32 terabytes is a lot of storage, but when you're dealing with these huge videos, it was filling up. And when we were syncing with Dropbox, we go and look. Right now, we're using 116 terabytes of space on Dropbox because Dropbox gave us unlimited storage for a long period of time. We just let it keep going and growing, and we would just choose what to sync. But even then, there would be enough projects actively being worked on, and enough times we'd send a client a version of something, go, oh, hey, we need another graphic, we need another something that we'd have to sync, that it was this constant pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling that was really hard to wrangle.
Yeah, and so we started to think about our workflow and how can we improve that, right? So we looked into Synology to see what they might be able to offer us as far as an upgrade path. We liked Synology, their OS and the Dropbox sync was super easy to set up and put together. But even in there, as you can see here, the price was kind of high. And we were only getting about 163 terabytes. And if we, were looking at how we were going to store that with Dropbox, that would be over 70% if we were storing all of our Dropbox on that.
All right, yeah. So basically, immediately we get it, and it's immediately full, and 70% isn't all the way full, but we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Once you get past that 70, 80% number, it starts getting a lot slower to use these kind of NAS systems. And so we needed to keep looking. Another problem, too, with this Synology is that they really want you to use their drives, which are more expensive. They max out at 18 terabytes per drive, so the storage density is a lot lower. But as you said, cloud sync and stuff, there's a lot to love about Synology and what they do, but we decided to keep looking. We know of a company called iXSystems. You had much more direct experience with them. I kind of knew of them, but wasn't super familiar. They have a rack mountable system that you can buy that you can put up to 12 drives into. And since iXSystems and TrueNAS is open and kind of communally available, you can put up to 20 terabyte, 22 terabyte, who cares, drives into it. Even still, though, that maximum amount of storage is like about 175 terabytes, which is just really at the edge of like, well, this is what we currently have. Imagine what we're going to be having in the future, like what's going to become our data retention policy. We wanted to be really prepared for if that file size kept growing. So this didn't feel like an immediate solution, but there was stuff we liked about this idea.
Yeah, so with it being TrueNAS, as you can see, they sell appliances, iXSystems, and they're kind of the maintainer of the software. But like you said, it's open source. So you're able to kind of build your own systems. So that's when we started doing the research and kind of looking into how we could do that. So we went on to YouTube, as you're watching us right here on YouTube, and kind of looked around at what other creators might be doing. So we had Lawrence Systems, Level 1 Techs, who does a really good deep dive on ZFS, Art of Server to kind of help with some of the hardware, and then Craft Computing when it came to some of the hardware chassis, that we needed to be able to tie it all together to hold that motherboard and all of those hard drives. So yeah, we ended up turning to the YouTube community. LTT ended up putting out a video right around the same time, which was really helpful, the Mark Rober NAS build. And we ended up kind of ending up with similar specs as a result because they just came in at a really good price to performance ratio that we really liked.
Yeah, yeah, and something that too came out of this is we noticed that there were a lot of problems we knew that we faced that they were kind of solving in different ways. They're talking about they built two systems, not just the one, and so it's like, oh well, there's this kind of offsite backup. Morgan and I, at the time, we were having some fears with Dropbox and going, okay, well, what happens, if Dropbox were to, oh, I don't know, say that the unlimited storage is no longer available, like that would ever happen. Just what would happen, what would we do in that sort of scenario? So there were a few things that we really liked about this system when we looked at it, which is that we could have 250 terabytes or more of actual usable space, that we could have 10 gigabits or more of networking throughput, meaning that as our team expands, we could have multiple editors, multiple people accessing this NAS at full speed, being able to edit stuff with like raw footage. We don't work a lot with raw footage, but as time is moving forward, as our kind of behind the scenes capabilities are growing, it's something we're encountering more and more. Plates, for instance, are a huge thing we use raw video for, and so we wanted to have that ability to have really high bandwidth networking. And also something that we didn't initially think much of were virtualization capabilities. Now, this is something we thought was cool, and we're like, hey, we're going to go with TrueNAS Scale over Core. There's two different versions of TrueNAS, and Scale allows you to do these sort of virtualizations and also kind of grow multiple systems. And we like to be not on the bleeding edge, but the cutting
The
one.
cutting one.
We like to research these sorts of things, and it was stable. It's been stable enough
Yeah.
for everything we've needed. And so we like the idea of doing these things because we kind of envision a lot of different things we can do. We haven't done all of those things, but we have made good use of the virtualization, and it's actually been really important to a lot of our workflows.
Yeah, we've definitely developed new workflows when it comes to that, especially with all the advancements that we're seeing right now in AI. We're really heavily utilizing some of those to help with file management and documenting all of our files and making it searchable, which is really cool to see. So let's talk about some of the hardware chassis. We ended up with the Supermicro 846 that you can see here, 24 bays at 3.5 inch drives. And the big thing here is it fits standard eATX boards, which means you can fit ATX, micro ATX, all the different standard computing size. This chassis was a little bit difficult to come across. We had to end up going onto the used market here and search around on eBay for quite a while to find it because there's just a couple different variants when it comes to this. Kind of tell me about that.
Yeah, yeah. So part of our problem here is that when you're searching for a Supermicro chassis, a lot of them have a server already built in. We didn't want to go with kind of these older server solutions, even though they'd be plenty powerful. You can go get these multiple CPU Xeon systems. They just take a lot of power. They make a lot of noise. And so we wanted something that was modern and quiet, had a lot of room for expansion, really was future-proofed. And honestly, the hardware cost of sort of the newer, more modern server hardware is really not that expensive. But the hardest part here is finding a chassis that can fit these sorts of things. Those multiple core Xeon systems, they have very different motherboard layouts. So you can't take one of those chassis that would have had exactly all the other specs we needed and put in a modern day motherboard. This actually ended up being the single most expensive component in the entire NAS. It was just over $1,000. Now, the reason that is because this is a SAS-3 backplane. It's got two 1200 watt 80 plus platinum power supplies in it. It's was in great condition. And so it came with a lot of these things that are expensive. Supermicro doesn't really sell these chassis individually. I believe you can acquire them new through other like third parties, but generally speaking, Supermicro is going to sell you an entire server. And so finding these sorts of chassis is really hard. There are much easier to find if you're in a situation that's different than us, 36 bay 846 4U chassis or 12 bay 2U chassis. The problem with those is both of them have 2 U's of space for the server. And so when you're cooling the server, it's going to be a lot louder. You're going to have to crank those fans up a bit more. That's something for us we were really conscious of. If you've seen any of the debrief, you might have noticed in the back of the room where we record there, that's where all our server racks are. We have to live in the same space as these things. It's not a soundproofed, isolated space. And so because of that, we wanted to make sure we had something that really kept quiet and cool all at the same time. So we wanted that full 4U, which we'll talk a bit more about that later, but we wanted that full 4U, and that means a 24 bay one. And they're really hard to find. I mean, when we found this one, there were 2 units available the morning I saw it, by mid-afternoon, one of them was already sold. We bought the second one.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, I looked recently. I didn't even find another one of these. A lot of times they'll come with a different, slower backplane. That's probably okay, depending on your kind of workflow. But a lot of those that have that slower backplane are, again, those weird Xeon-shaped ones that you can't really fit stuff in. So we're really happy with this. We're really glad we chose it. But I think if you're someone who's out there, you're maybe a bit of a smaller team, you maybe have a bit more space, you could go with something a bit smaller and
Mhm.
still end up really happy.
Yeah, and then continuing on, looking at some of the specs that we ended up choosing here for our system, we went with the ASRock rack Rome motherboard here. The main things that I liked about it was all the different PCIe slots that you had. You had M.2 for NVMe, IPMI for remote management, and all that good stuff. And it supported our AMD EPYC platform, which is very important for us because that has all the PCIe lanes, which we were very grateful for. And we're not currently utilizing all of that right now, but it lets us expand down the road by adding in more storage or graphics cards. We have all the PCIe lanes available to make that super fast and speedy for us down the road.
You know, something we feel with the general studio space a lot of times is we are limited more by our space than we are by our ability,
Mm,
right? And so, in a funny way, we wanted to build this computer with a ton of space,
mm.
right? This is a big empty warehouse that we currently are storing like 4 little boxes in, so we wanted to build something that was super expandable. One thing to note about this specific motherboard, this is that BCM variant you'll see at the end there. That means it's using a Broadcom chipset for its 10 gig LAN port, which is great. We love having 10 gig LAN. However, on the Intel variant before this, it had you could take the both 10 gig LAN ports, and make it 20 gigs
Mhm.
of throughput on the same thing, which would have been super cool, but finding those is a lot more rare. Also, really weird. They're right angle connectors on the bottom. You can't
Yes.
plug in any of the front panel connectors on this board with our server chassis because it comes right up against the end of it. So if you end up buying something like this, just know you're not going to get to use those front panel connectors. It's not really a big deal. You don't really need them, especially with IPMI, which this has. So those are small little things, but some bumps in the road we ran into on that regard.
Yeah, and then I'll come back around to the CPU cooler here in a moment. I just want to hit some of these other specs real quick. Well, we ended up with 128 gigabytes of RAM. That's 432 gigabyte RAM modules. And the reason why is ZFS has this concept called ARC. Um, and so what that's doing is it's keeping your most recent files cached. That means it's super fast to access anything that's in that RAM cache. We're also utilizing two 1 terabyte NVMe drives as a level 2 ARC so that when our RAM is full, all of our data that we still need cached ends up there. Again, we're seeing great performance gains out of that. Additionally, we have the LSI 9700 HBA, which is handling all of the hard drives, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. But turning back to the CPU cooler, this ended up being very challenging. We went through a couple different CPU coolers to make sure it fits and the fans were oriented the correct way. Talk about that.
Yeah. So it's funny because part of the problem with the Supermicro 846 is also there's a lot of different models out there. As I mentioned, right, there's those that are 846s but are meant for completely different motherboards than the one we had. And so figuring out which one exactly you have can be pretty difficult. And so finding what cooler compatibility through Noctua has an amazing cooler compatibility section. They're great folks over there. And we're trying to figure out, okay, what does fit and what doesn't fit. What we ended up discovering is that this cooler right here, the NHD9DX4 677, which is actually made for Intel Xeon platforms, is ideal for this cooler, for this CPU, because it's going to blow across the CPU from right to left on that motherboard. So if you look, at that motherboard picture, you're going to see how the CPU is oriented. It's going along that lengthwise of the CPU, whereas any other cooler that is SP3 mounting hardware from Noctua, for some reason, goes 90 degrees the other way. So it's going to pull air in from the top and push it down towards the bottom, or vice versa. You can put the fans whichever way you want. But we're like, well, we don't want the air coming in from the case and then going down and out. It's like we want it to be kind of all that same path of airflow. And so that's actually how we ended up with this specific cooler. We did try to see if we could get a 120 millimeter cooler to fit, and it almost does, but it doesn't. You would need a hammer or a Dremel, and we're like, we want this thing to be truly for you. We're not
Mm.
modifying this case. We just spent a bunch of money on it. Like, let's do what properly fits within it. And underneath that cooler is the 7302P, which is a EPYC CPU that goes a little higher in clock speed, but a little lower in core count. So that means you're getting faster file transfers with SMB because it's a single-threaded workload, compared to something like NFS, which is multi-threaded but a little more complicated, so we don't use it for our setup. And so with that, we've kind of like found that honestly it's overkill. The 7302P, it's more than we need by a long shot, but it gives us some room to grow and do things like virtual machines and all that sort of stuff. So
Yeah, I think we're barely like 20%
at most, maybe. I don't even know if I've
utilization.
seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that ended up, being kind of the hardware selection that we went. Speaking of our hard drives and HBAs and all that, we possibly have an issue with our HBA.
Yeah, there's a chance it's counterfeit. These are apparently fairly common. Art of Server kind of pointed out this problem on their YouTube channel, and we had a weird issue pop up where essentially when we went to do a large write operation, so for instance, we've been pulling down data from our Dropbox, so 30 terabytes of data to write over the course of however, like, the week that it takes, and that would all of a sudden cause random drive write or read errors. And we're like, well, this is weird. These are brand new drives. It does happen. They do fail. But then if you go and manually check the data inside the shell, you'd find out, oh, there are no errors. And if you reboot the system, they all disappeared. What we think was happening is that because on the PCI lanes, it was sharing the same bandwidth as the two M.2 SSDs, that meant that it was not quite sure where all the data should go because the lane wasn't bifurcated inside of our BIOS. That may have been a thing that could have fixed it. We don't know, because what we did instead was we moved it up a slot and gave it its own slot because we had plenty of slots available. We're like, we're just going to give this thing its whole own slot as close to the CPU as possible. And since then, it's been rock solid. We just finished another pull down from Dropbox, and not a single one of those errors
Yeah,
popped up. A different error did pop up, but we'll talk about that later because
yeah,
it's not the next slide.
yeah. So continuing on here, we ended up with 24 hard drives in this system. And we got that from server part deals. And we ended up doing a RAID Z3 configuration for our array. So ZFS uses a concept called VDEVs, which is a software-defined RAID solution versus a hardware-defined RAID. And what we did was we did two different pools of RAID Z3s, 12 drives each. And we did them in a Z3, meaning we can lose up to 3 drives, any of the 3 drives, in each of those arrays, and still have all our data. The cool thing about ZFS is it does data protection regarding like bit rot and things like that, because what can happen is over time as you write data and read data, if you're not reading it often or doing what they call scrubs, the data can just slowly disappear because it's just a magnetic disk, right? So things over time can get weird or get wonky, and so ZFS really helps with the data protection on that end of things.
Yeah, and going back to server parts deals real
Mhm.
quick, they were fantastic. They packaged everything super well. Their customer support was super helpful. They let us know, hey, by the way, hard drive prices are about to go up, which they have. And so that kind of pushed us to go ahead and say, hey, we're filling this thing because,
Mhm.
if we don't do it now, it'll cost more money later. We've got the money to kind of fill this thing, go all the way out. And so we did. Um,
Oh, and we ended up not doing we do have 2 cold spares, but we
yes.
ended up not leaving them as, like, hot spares in the system. A lot of people might wonder why we didn't do that, right? So if we had a hot spare, it would have been just sitting in our system, not really doing anything. But if a drive had failed, it would have immediately replaced it. With Z3, we're able to utilize that hot spare, and it just already has all the data on it so that there's no like rebuild time, essentially. We still do have 2 cold spares that we can just pop in when we do have a drive failure, but that's why we kind of went with this RAID Z. It gave us the most amount of storage and the performance, and we didn't feel like we were like leaving a hard drive on the table, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, we went back and forth a lot on the hot spare idea because on paper, what's amazing about a hot spare is if a drive fails, it's immediately fixing the problem. But at the same time, we thought, well, wait a minute, if a drive fails and there's, up to 3 drives that can fail, we're going to be there the next morning to
Mhm.
be able to swap out a drive at most. So realistically, we kind of were like, not sure how that hot spare would really help us when
Mhm.
our data is not super mission critical. If we were having a colo, if we had this system in a place where we couldn't easily access it, we absolutely would be running a hot spare because we don't know when we can get there.
Right.
But with this system, we know that, hey, we're going to be there all the time. You and I, we both
Mhm.
live close. If one of these drives was to fail on a Saturday, we had to get here, we absolutely could. It would not be a problem at all, and it'd take 10 minutes to
Yeah.
swap the drive out. And so in the end, that's kind of why we decided to go that way. We don't know the long-term effects of this, right? We don't know, maybe this was a horrible idea, but so far it's been super performant.
Yeah.
It works great. What we really love about TrueNAS, you and I, is it doesn't lie to you.
Right.
And if it does, it's a bug that they're fixing.
Mhm.
Like they're
They're on
never,
it.
yeah, they're never trying to tell you the wrong information. Something we noticed with Synology, we mentioned ARC cache. It
Yeah.
uses a lot of RAM. Synology does the exact same thing. They just lie and don't tell you it's doing it, right? Because as a user, that doesn't really
Right.
matter to most people. You don't need to know that you would be scared. Why is my RAM full? What I
Mhm.
have this much RAM. Why is it filling it? Is something wrong? No, it's fine. It's to help speed everything up. You don't need to know that's getting used. But TrueNAS respects your intelligence and says, hey, here's everything that's happening. You have full control over what's
Right.
going on here. But it does so in a way that I would say is a lot more user friendly than a lot of other open source pieces of software that I've used. And I think that comes from the fact that this is also a purchasable product. It's not just a open source piece of software, but there is also their own hardware, and they need to make sure that it feels like a relatively consumer product in that regard.
Absolutely. So we ended up with 349 terabytes worth of space on our NAS. We're capping that at 80% because we noticed with Synology, if we filled at the 90%, we were having all sorts of problems with that. So Isaac, why do we cap it at 80%?
Yeah, it's something that, I think is not like, if you aren't somebody who's like thinking about it, you're like, well, it says I have this much space. Why can't I use it all? But if you start thinking of it in a real world way, it makes a lot of sense. If you have a room that's 80% full of stuff, it's going to be a lot harder to find places to put stuff. And so if I have a big couch, I have to fit in a room that has 80 couches in it. I may have to saw parts of that couch off and put them in different places. And then, hey, I need that couch. Well, I got to go find them and glue them all together and hand it back to you. And so that's why we're kind of having this soft cap. Now, we can absolutely exceed it, but what's good about this is it's our canary in the coal mine. It says, hey, once we've
Hmm.
hit this full, either we've got to start culling our data and deleting things, or we need to consider how we're going to expand. And
Yeah.
that's another great thing about PCI expansion and TrueNAS. We can go out and buy a disk shelf, even from someone like NetApp, which makes their own kind of NAS
Hmm.
solution, but you can go buy a used disk shelf out there online and put it into, kind of connect it into the system and have another 24 drives if we needed it. So we love kind of that expandability, that openness to do whatever we need to do to make it work for us.
And you might be watching this video right now and wondering, okay, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, should I do this myself? Well, sometimes you shouldn't do it yourself because we've come across a fair amount of errors in this process,
Yeah.
with between the HBA, these weird PCIe errors, which we'll talk about here. Uh, there's a lot of challenges, but we're both techies. Like, we
Mhm.
both kind of understand this stuff and we like to learn. So for
Yeah.
us, this was a great project to learn.
Right. And some of the things we came across, for instance, like, is this PCIe error that we keep getting that we have no idea what it means whatsoever. It doesn't seem to impact performance. It doesn't seem to change anything. It seems to maybe pop up on large write operations. Sometimes it just happens for no other reason. This is one of what we do know is it's one of the SSDs that we have plugged in, those Samsung NVMe drives, and that it's just having whatever this error is on those, one specific one, not the other one. It's just this one drive.
Mhm.
We've Googled this. I've looked it up. There's no information. If one of you can figure this out, my eternal thanks is all I can currently offer to you. But it's stuff like this where, we Googled it. One of the answers we found to this, we found one answer, and it was that they just disabled that error. Just turned it off.
Yeah, just turn it off.
Just ignored it. I'm like, oh, great. So, if you're one of those people where you're not super techy, and also if you don't need a massive amount of space, I think most people,
Mhm.
if you're working with clients, you probably can have 100 terabytes of stuff and that be your max, right?
Yeah.
So, and even with that TrueNAS system, if you are a little more DIY scrappy, but don't want to be this DIY scrappy, you probably could find a way to go and get a disk shelf and attach it to that. Like,
Yeah.
there's these kind of things are possible. But it just depends on what you're looking for.
Now, there are things about TrueNAS that aren't perfect. One of those mainly being Cloud Sync. Synology has that figured out really well. For us, we use Dropbox kind of as a final delivery for our clients. So being able to get our data, specifically finals, up to Dropbox is very important for us. And that's what the Synology was doing very well. Currently, we don't have a great solution for that. iXSystems says that they're integrating more stuff in the TrueNAS, and that's partially why we went with Scale, is that's where they'll integrate that. But yeah, it's not perfect. It's not for everyone. Again, if you have a Synology or something like that, that may be the perfect solution for those out there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you said, the interesting thing that happened with Dropbox is now they have cut off their unlimited storage, as I alluded to earlier. So we're realizing, okay, we need to be able to be self-sufficient in hosting our data.
Mhm.
And one thing we would really hate is to have a client who who comes frequently to us and say, hey, do you have this one file, this version of it or whatever? And for us to just have the answer be no. We
Right.
want to figure out how can we best serve people. So we are looking into more backup solutions. Are we going to build a second one of these and put it in a colo somewhere? Are we going to look into tape backups? But these are sorts of things that with Synology would have been much harder to implement. So I
Mhm.
think if you are in a position where you're kind of the IT guy for your video
Mhm.
people and you're trying to figure out how do we store all of our data in a way that's very accessible and robust, that's really cool. But if you're just a person who, hey man, I film a video for a client, I send them the edit and it's done. You probably don't need this level of security and whatever. If
Yeah.
you are someone who's been using those SanDisk drives, right?
Mhm.
But you are looking for a little bit more, there's plenty in the middle there. And so we've called this system TrueNAS Webster. Webster's kind of the short name for it. It's kind of our dictionary of stuff. It's where all our video goes. And so giving something a fun name is a core part of IT. If you don't give something a fun name, you are just a sad person. I'm so sorry to tell you. But it's nice to be able to have some affectionate names to refer to things. We got
Yeah.
to figure out our other names. Are they going to stay as W's? We have the idea of calling Synology Watson if we use it around in the system, or are we going to come up with other dictionaries? There's a lot of
Yeah.
dictionaries. There's a lot
There's
of
a lot out
languages.
there.
So if you have any name suggestions, please let us know in the comments below for those sorts of things. And also let us know what you do to store all of your data. What's your strategy? How do you manage everything? How do you get your files to clients? Is there something you've come across where you're like, oh man, this is the ideal solution? Nobody's talking about this thing.
Mhm.
We'd love to hear from you. And also let us know if you want to hear more from us about the specifics of what we're doing here. Kind of how we've configured this stuff, how we're making it work with all our systems. There's plenty that we've done that
Mhm.
there is a lot of information out there on the internet about, but it's sometimes good to hear it, from different sources and get like, oh, sometimes, we would watch videos building into this and one
Mhm.
person mentions the one detail we needed to know that the other person totally forgot. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope that you have a good rest of your day.